The Minoans used a syllabary, not an alphabet. That means each symbol represented a full syllable, not a sound. Vowels are an exception. The Minoans had symbols for theirs. I love syllabaries. They're harder to learn because there are at least twice as many symbols, but they're 100 times easier to use.
The Cretans used the linear A syllabary for more than 500 years that we know of. They first exported it to Cyprus. Nobody knows exactly when. It was used for the original language there for about 600 years. Scholars call it Cypro-Minoan. Later, the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece borrowed it for about 300 years until the Bronze Age collapse, although it might have survived a little longer. Evidence is strong. The Cretans developed it for them in the palace of Knossos. The Greeks who later settled on Cyprus loved the syllabary probably as much as I do. They'd use it for about 800 years, all the way to the time of Alexander the Great. All told, our system survived about 18 centuries. Not too shabby for a homegrown system pulled together by a tiny group like us. There are only about 600,000 people on Crete even today. About 1450 BC, after what all the world thought was a successful invasion of Crete from the mainland, the Cretans suddenly started writing in Linear B Greek and abandoned their whole culture. But this was only an official change. The only thing officials used the Linear B for was tax records. We have no idea what the rank-and-file Minoan was speaking between then and the Bronze Age collapse 200 years later.
Incidentally, 1450 BC is the exodus of the Israelites, according to the Bible. The invasion idea tidily explained all of the facts on the ground. But recently, Argyro Nafplioti of the British School at Athens surveyed the bones of the so-called invaders and proved they were born and raised on Crete, and then went on to show they were almost certainly ethnic Cretans. So how now, brown cow? I think this is a religious civil war. I think the side that created the Phaistos Disc lost. I think the classic Minoans were strange and alien to the Greeks, and a critical mass of Cretans got sick and tired of being strange and alien. So a war was provoked. The side that won out-Greeked the Greeks, more Catholic than the Pope. So when scholars uncovered their remains, they were armored like Greeks and buried like Greeks. The cities were burned to the ground and everybody's writing Greek, so these are Greeks. Nope. Now, before I started pulling the script together for this video, I last minute stumbled over the latest findings in Philistine archaeology. And I think they were using Linear A. So I'm going to go ahead and make a note on this map that they were using Linear A all the way up to about 1200 BC. After that, they switched to an alphabet and abandoned their original language altogether. I think the Philistines actually invented the alphabet. Maybe I shouldn't go that far, but I know they were active participants in its formation. I'll prove all that before I'm done. Now, we've all been taught that the Phoenicians invented the alphabet, and we believe that because that's what the Greeks said. Were they wrong? By our definition, they were. But that's not what the Greeks meant when they said Phoenician. To them, everybody in that part of the Mediterranean was Phoenician, including the Israelites, and apparently including the Philistines. By the time they would have helped the Greeks develop their alphabet, they would have abandoned their original language and adopted a local Canaanite dialect centuries before. So they all looked alike to the Greeks. There are 3 systems of Linear A to be aware of here. The first is the Cretan hieroglyphics, which is still a syllabary, just with Egyptian-like symbols. The second is what Andres Zeke called the festive font on his site. I like that. It's a font on the Phaistos Disc. And he's the one who pointed out it's also on these golden seals. It's also in the Archelacoryx, which we'll briefly touch on in a bit. Looks different, but it's also a dressed-up Linear A. Most documents are in a fast draft, easy-to-use script. I'm going to walk through a few of the more interesting symbols that I think have survived to this very day, and also some of the important ones that I need to rely on to draw some of my conclusions. Obviously, if Owens and Coleman are wrong about them, some of my arguments will fall apart. Before we start actually looking at the Linear A, I want to show you a few things first. In the beginning, they're going to look like alien gibberish, but after we're all done, not so alien gibberish. The first 2 are texts found at Philistine archaeological sites. We're a million miles away from anything looking like a consensus on what they are, but I think there's a good shot that they're Linear A.
The first is the Aphek fragment. Now the Ashkelon fragment. And finally, an ABCdery from the same period. It's just like it sounds. Somebody's practicing their ABCs. There's a very good chance this person is a Hebrew speaker. Get a good look. Roll back the video and pause if you want. Gibberish now, very familiar when we're done. Promise. Okay, now to the main show. Here are all the symbols on the Phaistos disc. The vowels are here along the left. E, I, U, Ow. Then across the top, I've marked the consonants. As you can see, the Minoans included weird ones like the Ria and the Nua. And here's the hammer of Thor. Actually, it's a labrys, a two-headed axe. It's a symbol for Ah. It's not actually on the disc, but we'll be seeing it very soon. These symbols are unknown. We can read the Greek linear B, but nothing of the linear A unless we have something in the Greek we can follow through on, and these don't show up there. Doctors Owens and Coleman think these are the R and Ria series, but with all the respect in the world, I think these are actually the L and Lia series, because like them, I think we spoke an Indo-European language, and a very old one. And we know from the Anatolian languages that the words in ancient Indo-European languages never started with an R sound. They couldn't say river, for example. They had to say liver or a river. So since they either didn't have an R series or they didn't have an L series, and we know this is true, I'd say they went without an R series and used the L series for both.
I got this idea from Andres Seek's Minoan blog, and I think he nailed it. But he did get one thing wrong. We didn't build our written language around loan words from Aryans in Anatolia. I'm sure we borrowed words from them, but we borrowed 10 times more from the Greeks. We borrowed from the Egyptians. We borrowed from the Semites in the state of Ugarit in Syria. By the time these Aryans had supposedly conquered our homeland, we would have been on Crete for more than 1,000 years. So this is just another bunch of foreigners to us, and not even the most interesting or profitable ones. This shows me the absurd conclusions you're forced to draw if you cannot accept that we're the Aryans. So, let's see if we can catch the Minoans using the R symbol for L words. And as it happens, Andres has given us two splendid examples, the Minoan words behind Ru and Re.
Here are all the examples for Ru we have from linear A. It's not on the Phaistos disc, but what if Ru were actually Lu? What could that be? How about Allura, Greek for lyre? It looks like one. Here you can see their lyres seem to have had a base. Now let's visit the old Cretan hieroglyphics, see what they can give us. They give us luras, with that very distinctive shape. Looks like we've added another Minoan word to our vocabulary. Here are the different examples for Re, which is on the Phaistos disc. It doesn't look a lot like it here, but it's a lily, leron in Greek, which is where we got the word from. That really shows up in the hieroglyphics, as you can see from these examples of known Cretan hieroglyphics, along with the numbers assigned to them by scholars. Coleman and Owens think all of these symbols represent the same sound. Here's one with the petals, and a very detailed one with petals and stems. Here are the stems. Those are probably a lot easier to carve into stone. And here's a real lily. As you can see, the stems are just as striking as the petals. I never knew that until I started working with this word. So I guess the Greeks got their word for lily from the Minoans. That would make sense because this is ultimately an Egyptian word, and it's the Minoans who got the closest contact with Egypt. So it looks like we've got another Minoan word.
And I see a pattern with both of these words. La and ra are used in the exact position you would expect them to if this were an old Indo-European language. Certainly enough for proof of concept of how they were used in the Minoan. Later I'm going to work through a Ria word. That symbol shows up on the Phaistos disc. It plays a huge role in some of my translation attempts. One of the tools we're going to use a lot here is the table for the International Phonetic Alphabet. I'll call it the Ipa Table from here on out.
This isn't the full table, but it's big enough for anything we're doing here. This is important because we'll be talking about evolving words, and some potential word migrations are a lot more plausible than others. Vowels travel like crazy, but consonants are a lot more conservative. So when I think I'm looking at some kind of sound migration in a consonant, I always refer back to this trusty IPA table. I especially look for minimal pairs. A minimal pair is when two words differ by only one meaningful sound. For example, bat and beat, or bat and bad. For example, here we see t and d. These are both alveolar. The tip of your tongue hits the alveolar when you say them. Both are plosives. The only difference is one buzzes the vocal cords and the other doesn't. Voiced and voiceless. Now s and z. Same thing, only they're fricatives. Okay, let's get started. We'll start with the syllable P on the disc. Now remember, this is a syllabary, not an alphabet. So this doesn't just represent the P sound. Here's what it looked like in the various documents archaeologists have recovered. Now when I was working with the Minoan words on the Phaistos Disc, I noticed that a lot of terms ended up getting borrowed by the Greeks. But what was striking is that the terms starting with the P sound always changed to a F. An example is the city of Phaistos itself. In the Old Mycenaean Greek and Minoan, it's written Phaito. That's when I noticed the similarities between P and Phi from the Greek alphabet. The last is really just a simplified version of the first, and survives today among people like the Greeks and the Russians. They dropped the antennae. The bodies are more rounded, friendly. The old P really looked belligerent, didn't it? You can see the position of the body relative to the line shifts in the P and in the Phi in the beginning. The interesting part is this is the Minoan P. Here's the Greek linear B P. So whoever did this was familiar with the Minoan P 700 years after it was supposed to be extinct. The symbol they used on Cyprus was even more different. So the Minoan for B is P, or something that included P. The Latin for B, opus, or opus. And in case you're curious, this is a very well-known symbol. We already know what it represents. Now here's the C on the Phaistos Disc, if Owens and Coleman are right. And here are the samples from preserved documents. As you can see, the scribes would have captured this curve at the end, and the line in the center, a shorthand. Sometimes they went even farther in trying to capture the bone shape. Here's the Greek C, which captures the Minoan C very nicely, but once again, not the linear B version, or the Cypriot. And once again, 700 years after linear A was supposed to be extinct. But the Greek C does favor the image on the far right. What does it have in common with the bone above? The caved-in side in the line. Which makes me wonder if the Phaistos discs, and you can be sure there used to be a lot of these, also served as a way to unify the writing, and give you an opportunity to play with it, maybe come up with utterly different symbols that can still be understood because they're riffing off of a common image. Poetry and imagery? And if Owens and Coleman are right, we've got another match with the Latin. The image of a bone is C. The Latin for bone? Os, or ossus. I would say, take this seriously. Here's the Minoan key. It's not on the disc, so we don't have a festive font. Here's how it shows up in the samples. Here's how it shows up in the Mycenaean Greek, which is very similar, and the Cypriot. Still reminds us of the earlier shapes. And here's the key from the later Greek alphabet, which captures the intent of the message exactly.
It's when I was looking over these three symbols that it became obvious to me somebody is still literate in linear A, 600 years after it's supposed to be extinct. What do these three letters have in common? Well, they're all used in Greece, but they're not present in Lebanon and Palestine where the alphabet first showed up. So whereas with all the rest they followed the Eastern Mediterranean lead, here they look back to the Minoan syllabary. Originally, I think they all look back to the original Minoan. I'll show you what I mean in part 4.
Now here's Pa. I need to look at it because, number one, Owens and Coleman aren't 100% on it. But most importantly, this symbol is going to loom large in a word I'll be working with, so I need it to be right. This is what Pa looks like in the samples we have of linear A. They seem to be saying, it looks like a sword, but it's not a sword. It's got these bumps and protrusions. So what looks like a sword but isn't a sword and has bumps and protrusions? A bludgeon. This is the handle. These are the bumps. Make this thing of some really hard wood and you can do serious damage to somebody's skull. The Latin for club or bludgeon is trabs or trabus. P and B are minimal pairs. Bilabial, lips touch. One buzzes the vocal cords, the other doesn't, voiced and unvoiced. And this is probably right. Zo is next. Coleman and Omans think it's represented by this symbol on the Minoan documents. It probably is. There's the vaguely triangular shape here, and the two arms reaching out beneath it. Coleman and Owens tell us why they connected this symbol with this sound here. Olivier, in 2013, sees A318, which is here, continuing into the Cypro-Minoan and classical Cypriot row. The Cypriot R plus vowel series generally correspond to the linear A, B, Z plus vowel. Here are some samples of how the row looked over time in Cyprus. Here's the final form of the syllable. Well, it doesn't look like the Minoan symbol Coleman and Owens identify as row, and younger, might I add. That's because the R series became the L series on Cyprus, which, as I said, is what I think it actually was on Crete. So let's look at the Cypriot R series. Here's the Cypriot Ra and the Minoan Za. Notice the Minoan looks like the Egyptian Ankh. Very close match. And you'll see, very important, they shaved off that bottom line on Cyprus. Re and Ze. Ze is a Sa, and that's probably what they called one. So Re looks like a cleaned up Ze, and the orientation change, which hardly mattered back then. And what's the Latin for Sa? Sera, or Sere. As you can see from our trusty IPA table, Z and Sa are minimal pairs. So we got another Minoan word that migrated nicely into Latin. Lovely. Re has no counterpart Z on either Crete or mainland Greece, as far as we know right now. So they just reworked their ni and ke. And Ru looks nothing like Zu, which is the feather end of an arrow. It's on the Phaistos Disc, by the way. I suspect from looking at the Minoan samples, they just wanted to clean the mess up. Also, they tended to write on clay, while the Minoans often wrote with pen and paper. So they went with a simplified wa. Like the linear A script, it's a bear skin. The wa is also on the Phaistos Disc. You see loads of wa. You want to know how brilliant these guys were? Let's look at the IPA table and sort this all out. We're going to look at the alveolars. Travel down the column as your tongue travels from the top of the mouth downwards. Na. We're holding our tongue to the alveolar, forcing the air through the nose, nasal, more formally the nasal stop. Ta and da. These are the stops. But the air builds up and then we let it burst through, called the plosive on the table, which I think is a better description. The nasals are the real stops. Sa and za. We've dropped our tongue a little more and letting air pass through in a hiss. No stop. Now we're moving on down. Here's where we find the L sound and the R sound. They're not distinguished at all in most languages. They weren't in Egyptian, and we make fun of it with Orientals. Fa ra 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 ra. This is where the funniness comes in with all the old Indo-European languages. When you say la, you can see it's more physical, more obvious. The ra is called the approximate. Your mouth and tongue sort of kind of take on an interesting posture to make this sound. It's more complicated. I compare it to typing with your pinky. Typing the number 1, or God help you, the exclamation point. I've been typing for years and I still have to stop and think about those. So you can see why it would be a while before the R came into its own. Now this is the rolling R like you see in Spanish. The Romans called the R the lettera canina, the dog letter, because they rolled the daylights out of it and it sounded like a growling dog. When I first read the Minoans probably had a lot of trills in their language, I was disappointed. It didn't sound very manly to me. I was thinking tra-la-la or something like that. Something that would get your ass beat in ancient Rome. But the lettera canina plays right into my case. It's a very distinctive sound, and they were virtually neighbors. Just the Mediterranean separates Rome and Knossos. Now here's the za. As you can see, it's right above the ra. This is the modern IPA table, and I still have to physically look at it to see what they're doing, all while I'm referencing a modern phonetics textbook. These men were obviously masters of the art of language and the way the tongue moved. This is beautiful work. The la remained the la. The za moved down to stand definitively for the ra, and the Cypriots made up their own ra. So all this looks good, except there's a snag. This is the linear B for zo, and the symbol also shows up in linear A. As you can see, it looks nothing like either the Phaistos Disc image or the written symbol. But as I said, Cypro-Minoan also had a zo, and it doesn't look anything like either of them. So what I suspect is happening here is the Minoans used both symbols at one time or another for zo, or maybe at the same time for different reasons. John Younger suggests 318 is associated with people. That's 318. But there's another explanation, one which first led me to think that the events on Crete in 1450 BC might have been of the nature of a religious civil war, after I was forced to abandon the idea of a Greek invasion. This is the Egyptian Ankh, which represents life. It's a symbol for Za in linear A and linear B. Remember me telling you how this was important? Now we'll put the two Minoan symbols for Zo beside it. As you can see, they're both plausible departures from the Ankh. The Mycenaean on the left is a simplified version, but even the Zo candidate on the right is a plausible riff. Notice both symbols are unified at the top and split below into binaries. Of course, you could ask, why Zo? Why not one of the other Z's? Maybe because the Minoan word for life had a Zo in it. And when you know it, the Greek word for life is Zoe. I bet that's a loan word from the Minoan. So every day you say the word zoo, you're saying a Minoan word. Splendid. Another Minoan word. So putting all this mess together, I'd say Minoans nailed it. And the original Minoan symbol for Zo, which you see on the Phaistos Disc, was probably abandoned because it had an association with the old religion, and its adherents lost the Civil War. Now the next symbol is also going to take us very far back into the Indo-European past. It's the Ria, or more likely, Lia. Either case is fine. It shows up in the middle of the word I'm probing and is therefore allowed to have a Ria sound. Owens and Coleman seem to be comfortable with their decision of how this sound was made, but I'm not so sure. The word I think I've uncovered is very important, so I felt I needed to thoroughly confirm this. Turns out I was aptly rewarded. Here's a hieroglyphic version. Here's the written script. I was uncomfortable with this association because that last one looks like a river or stream, and the one of the Phaistos Disc looks like a bull's horn. What could these two possibly have in common? Turns out they have nothing in common. They don't need to. Let's zoom in. The shape here at the front of the two samples lines up with the same region of the shape on the Phaistos Disc. That's lovely. Zeke came to the rescue again, and once again, we're looking at very old Aryan. He dug up this Hittite stem, Arsa, for to flow and river, which I've confirmed, and this Sanskrit stem, Arsha, which means noble lineage. And what is a lineage but a stream of family ties through time? It's also a term for the old scriptures themselves in Hinduism. Not too shabby. It's pronounced like a sh, but with the tongue a little further back in the mouth. Sha. So the actual Minoan word for flow or stream could have been Arya, a well-behaved row word in the old European tradition. The consonant could have been softened through a process called lenition, which makes a consonant more vowel-like or sonorous. It would have been spelled out Arya. So now, the Ipa Table. Here's the Sanskrit sh and the Minoan ya, a strong family resemblance. Here's the Hittite sa. So once again, we're an old Indo-European language, probably sounding a lot like contemporary Iranian languages spoken at the time, on the way to becoming Latin. And I stress they were also metal people. We were the masters of bronze. And you need tin to make bronze. And right now, the best bet is we got our tin from Afghanistan. So we would have still been in very close contact with our brothers who migrated to Iran and parts east. So pull all this together, and we've nicely lined up a plausible migration of the word river from the ancient Hittite all the way to modern Spanish. Ardia, which is probably written like this in the Minoan syllabary. Then the funniness with the R sound is settled, and we drop A. Then the Romans add a well-known Indo-European suffix, was, which they spell V-U-S, pronounced wus. There's no V in Latin. Then Riawus, which is probably always Riwus. Then after the empire fell, the vulgar Latin Ria, which actually took us back to the original Minoan. Then from there to Rio, like Rio Grande and Rio de Janeiro. Lovely. You don't need to suspend disbelief. No need for exotic new rules. You're looking at 5,000 years of history, so there's plenty of time for the sounds to migrate, and most of this is solidly documented. So now the question remains of why the symbol looks so different on the Phaistos Disc from the written script. Well, here's our display of the symbols again. Let's pull out the typical Riyah. Here's how it compares to the scripted version. As you can see, it wouldn't have looked very good with the other fonts. So the Riyah here was never a bull's horn. It was a stream going off in the distance. Lovely. So Owens and Coleman nailed the Riyah. That's exactly what it is. Incidentally, in his first major battle of the Gallic Wars, Julius Caesar fought the Battle of the Aurora River. That's the Saône in modern France. We read this is the old Celtic name of the river, but Celtic is an Indo-European language like Latin, and after all our work, we can now see that it wasn't really a name. It was just called the river, and that was their word for river. As you can see, it's a very old word. This is the final symbol I'm going to work through before starting on the disc itself. Owl. Here an animal facing sideways. Owl is well known. Here's Owen's treatment of the Minoan precedents. Here are the various examples of owl. But owl is a pig. This is a cat. Here we see cats. And we saw a cat on the hieroglyphics example I showed earlier. This represents the sound ma. It's a cat or a mouse or a wombat. Who knows what the hell some of these critters are. But when I see a cat, I automatically think ma. But on the other hand, it's always facing you. And it's not always a cat. This is the Arcalacori axe, which bears another example of a Minoan festive font. You can see ma clearly here. Here it's a young man. So ma is probably face. Nothing like the Latin. The axe is largely readable if you know how to sound out linear A. The U is a hand holding stylus. There's no stylus here, but the hand is holding exactly the same shape. I think the stylus just wouldn't have looked very good with this font and this technique, so they added a couple of extra fingers instead. We'll actually see that symbol very soon, scratched into a libation table. This red looks good, except for that extra business on the bottom. And if the symbol on top of that is part of the actual word, it would probably be pronounced re, otherwise le, as discussed before. But I think the arrow above it is actually a start here symbol. I've seen this on examples of hieroglyphics. And so, going from right to left, the reading would be Leda iuna imate idanmana. Here's the actual symbol on the axe. He's got cool spiky hair, no? He looks very modern. In case you haven't noticed, Minoan Crete was the primordial homeland of cool hair. So I'm still torn. Facing sideways, but it's a cat. So what do the Cypriot and Mycenaean symbols look like? Stylized faces, staring right at you. So I would say, yes, this is right. They nailed it. And as I thought about it, I actually looked at a picture of a pig, and they do have pointy ears that come to the front of the head. And the snout here is flat. If they just pushed it out further, this would have looked just like a pig. Don't really know how this owl associated with the pig fits in with the other Indo-European languages. The Latin is sus. The Hittite is sa. This might be sal, with the s understood. It might be like the arya, in other words used in the syllabary, just part of a bigger word. The contemporary Avestan for a wild boar is hu, though. So maybe we're looking at the Minoan how or owl. And the Greek for pig is his. The Sanskrit is sukara. That means something that makes a sound su.